The frontier. A woman's cabin at the edge of territory where most settlers feared to tread alone. A scarred warrior, lay dying in the dirt, abandoned by those who should have saved him. But in 48 hours, that same woman would be sleeping on her floor while he occupied her only bed, a choice that defied every rule of survival in a land where fear divided people more than rivers ever could. What no one knew yet was that this single act of defiance would bring an entire nation to her doorstep. And when they arrived, nothing about her solitary existence would ever be the same. Lenora Hart's hands were still shaking when she dragged the unconscious man across her threshold. 2 years of widow solitude had taught her many things. How to split wood without crying, how to silence the night sounds that reminded her of loss, how to exist in the space between survival and living. But nothing had prepared her for the weight of a dying stranger or the decision that now sat like stone in her chest. The warrior's blood traced a dark path across her wooden floor. She should have been terrified. Any reasonable woman would have left him where he lay, half buried in creek mud with wounds that told stories of violence she didn't want to imagine. The scars covering his torso weren't fresh. Some were years old, raised lines that mapped a life of conflict she'd never understand. But the new injuries, the ones still seeping, those were the ones that would end him if she turned away. She knelt beside him, pressing cloth against the worst gash across his ribs. His breathing was shallow, irregular. Fever heat radiated from his skin. His long, dark hair was matted with dry blood and dirt. The leather band with its single feather barely clinging to his head. He looked nothing like the demons the neighboring settlers described in hushed, fearful voices. He looked like a man who'd been abandoned to die alone. The cabin seemed smaller with him in it. Her husband's rifle still hung above the door, untouched since his passing. A reminder of protection she no longer had. The single bed against the far wall, her bed, the only one, suddenly felt like the center of an impossible choice. She could leave him on the floor, let infection take him slowly while she pretended mercy had limits. Instead, she made a decision that would have horrified anyone who knew her. Lenora gripped his shoulders, feeling muscle and bone beneath skin too hot to touch, and began the slow, agonizing process of moving him to her bed. He was heavy, unconscious weight that fought her with every inch. Sweat dripped down her face. Her arm screamed, but she didn't stop. Not when his head lolled back, not when fresh blood seeped through the bandages she'd hastily wrapped. Not when she heard her own voice whispering words she didn't recognize, comfort or prayer. She couldn't tell which. When she finally settled him on the thin mattress, his body sprawled across sheets that still smelled faintly of lavender and loneliness. She stood back and stared at what she'd done. A stranger, a warrior, from a people her neighbors would curse her for helping. In her bed in her home, she pulled the rough blanket over him, tucking it around wounds that might take him anyway, despite everything she'd just risked. Then she spread her coat on the floor beside the bed, lay down on hard wood that would bruise her bones, and stared at the ceiling while questions hammered through her exhausted mind. What happened to him? Who left him? To die like discarded waste? And why? God help her. Why had she chosen this moment to remember what it felt like to be human? Outside, the wind picked up. Inside, the warrior's ragged breathing was the only sound besides her own racing heart. Dawn was still hours away, and Lenora Hart had no idea that by sunrise, her choice would set in motion something far bigger than either of them could survive alone. He woke like a man drowning, violent, disoriented, dangerous. Lenora barely had time to drop the water basin before his hand shot out and gripped her wrist. The strength in those fingers shocked her. She'd spent the night mopping fever sweat from his skin, changing blood, soaked bandages, certain he'd slip away before dawn. But now his eyes were open, dark and wild with confusion that could turn lethal in a heartbeat. She didn't scream, didn't pull away, just met his stare and waited for recognition to replace panic. It took longer than she expected. His grip tightened until pain shot up her arm. She could see him trying to process where he was. The wooden walls, the morning light through her window, the unfamiliar smell of her cabin, the white woman kneeling beside him with blood on her dress, his blood. When he tried to sit up, the wounds betrayed him. His face contorted, and he fell back against the pillow. Breath, coming in harsh gasps that rattled in his chest. But he didn't release her wrist. If anything, his hold grew more desperate, like she was the only solid thing in a world that had stopped making sense. Lenora spoke softly, knowing he wouldn't understand the words, but hoping tone would carry meaning. She gestured with her free hand to the bandages, to the water basin, to the door that remained closed. Safe. You're safe here. His eyes tracked her movements, searching for threat or trap. She could feel his pulse hammering against her skin where they touched. Fear and fury fought for control in his expression. How long had he been? Unconscious? Hours? Days? Long enough to lose all sense of what happened or why. This stranger had brought him inside, instead of leaving him to the mercy of scavengers and weather. She tried to pull her wrist free gently. His grip didn't budge, so she did something that defied every survival instinct she'd honed over 2 years alone. She reached out with her other hand and placed it over his. Not forcing, just contact, just pressure that said, "I'm not your enemy." The gesture seemed to confuse him more than comfort him. His jaw clenched. She watched him struggle with the impossibility of the situation. He was Apache. She was a settler. These were the simple facts that should have made this moment impossible. Yet here they were, connected by circumstance and choice, neither knowing what came next. Finally, slowly, his fingers loosened. Not a release, but a test. When she didn't immediately retreat, something shifted in his face. Not trust, not yet, but perhaps the first recognition that she could have harmed him while he lay helpless and hadn't. Lenora carefully withdrew her hand, showing him her palm, then pointed to the water basin again. He needed a drink. The fever had stolen too much from him already. She lifted the cup, brought it close to his lips. He turned his head away, pride wearing with thirst. She set the cup on the floor beside the bed and stood, giving him space. Her wrist throbbed where he'd gripped her. Small bruises were already forming, dark marks that would last days. She didn't care. He was awake. That meant the hardest part was still ahead, keeping him alive long enough to trust that she wanted nothing from him, except to see him survive. She moved to the window, giving him time to assess his surroundings without her hovering. Outside, the sun climbed higher. Inside, she could hear him breathing. Each inhale a struggle. Each exhale a small surrender to the pain that must be screaming through his body. When she finally turned back, he was watching her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. Not hostile anymore, but not grateful either, just calculating, trying to understand what debt he'd woken into and what price this woman would eventually demand for the life she'd apparently saved. What neither of them knew yet was that the real cost wouldn't come from her at all. It would come from what waited beyond these walls, a world that wouldn't forgive either of them for what she'd done. 3 days passed in careful silence. Lenora learned to read his pain in the way he held his breath when she changed bandages. The tension in his jaw when fever spiked at night. The subtle shift in his shoulders when he tried to hide how weak he still was. He watched her with the focus of someone memorizing escape routes, tracking her movements from bed to window to door like he was, mapping territory he might need to flee through. On the 4th morning, she woke to find him struggling to stand. She'd been sleeping on the floor beside the bed, her coat barely softening the hardwood that left her stiff and aching each dawn. But when she opened her eyes, he was gripping the bedpost, legs trembling with effort, determination, carved into features still too pale from blood loss. He was trying to get to the floor, try to take her sleeping place, so she could have her bed back. The gesture stopped her breath. Here was a man who'd been abandoned by his own people, left to die in creek mud, now attempting to sacrifice comfort he desperately needed because of some code of honor she hadn't expected. pride and practicality, fighting a battle his body wasn't strong enough to win. She moved quickly, crossing the small space before he could collapse. When she touched his arm to steady him, he flinched but didn't pull away. His skin was still too warm, fever lingering like an unwelcome guest. She could feel his muscles, shaking with exhaustion from just those few seconds of standing. Lenora shook her head firmly, the universal gesture of refusal. She guided him back down to the bed, gentle but insistent. He resisted at first, meeting her eyes with something that looked like shame, as if accepting her help made him less than what he should be, as if survival required him to suffer more than necessary. She knelt beside the bed and pointed her chest, then to the floor, then to him, then to the mattress. The meaning was clear. This is how it will be. Not because you're weak, but because I choose it. His expression shifted through emotions she couldn't name. Confusion, frustration, something that might have been respect. He said something in his language, words that rolled like thunder and water, sound she had no hope of understanding. But his tone carried weight. It wasn't gratitude exactly, more like acknowledgement of a debt he didn't know how to repay. She brought him water and the last of the dried meat from her stores, watched him eat slowly, each swallow an effort. His hands scarred and callous from years of life she couldn't imagine. Still trembled slightly, but there was strength, returning bit by bit. She could see it in the way he held himself now, less like someone dying and more like someone fighting to heal. That afternoon, while she worked outside, hauling water from the creek, she caught him watching her through the window. Not with suspicion anymore, with curiosity, like he was trying to solve a puzzle that didn't fit any pattern he knew. A white woman living alone, helping an enemy, sleeping on bare floor, while giving comfort to someone her people feared and hated. When she came back inside, arms aching from the weight of filled buckets, she found he'd attempted to straighten the blankets on the bed, despite obvious pain from the movement. A small gesture, an offering, the first sign that whatever was growing between them had moved past simple survival into something neither had words for. She met his eyes across the dim cabin, held his gaze for a moment that stretched longer than it should have. Something electric passed between them, unspoken but undeniable. Not romance, not yet, but recognition. Two people who'd been alone too long, finding unexpected connection in the last place either would have. Looked outside. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon. Inside, the air felt charged with questions neither dared ask. How long could this fragile peace last? What happened when he was strong enough to leave? And why did the thought of him disappearing back into the wilderness make her chest tighten with loss she had no right to feel? By the end of the first week, Neshoba refused to stay in bed any longer. Lenora found him outside at dawn, splitting wood with movements that were too careful, too controlled. Each swing of the axe caused him. She could see it in the way he paused between strikes, hand pressed briefly against his ribs where the worst wound still pulled an act. But he didn't stop, didn't look at her when she appeared in the doorway, arms crossed against the morning chill. She should have ordered it back inside. Instead, she picked up the kindling he'd already split and carried it to the woodpile. Without a word. If this was his way of reclaiming dignity, she wouldn't take that from him. A routine formed between them, built on actions instead of language. He'd wake before her and check the perimeter of the cabin, moving like someone trained to see threats and shadows. She'd prepare what little food they had, flour mixed with water for flatbread, wild herbs she'd gathered. Sometimes eggs from the 3 hens she kept behind the cabin. They'd eat in silence, but it wasn't the uncomfortable silence of strangers anymore. It was the quiet of 2 people who'd learned to exist in the same space without friction. He started teaching her things without speaking, how to spot tracks near the creek that meant deer had passed through, how to reinforce the fence posts that were rotting at the base, how to read weather in the way birds flew and clouds moved. She taught him in return, showed him where she kept the grain stores, how the latch on the door worked from inside, which plants near the property were safe to eat, and which would make you sick for days. On the 10th day, he disappeared. Lenora came back from checking her small vegetable garden to find the cabin empty. Her heart lurched. She searched the clearing, calling out despite knowing he wouldn't understand his name in her language. The forest beyond her. Property lines seemed darker suddenly, full of threats she'd been ignoring while he was near. Had someone found him? Had he grown strong enough to leave without warning? Had she been a fool to think this fragile connection meant anything to a man whose world was nothing like hers? Hours crawled past. The sun moved from overhead to afternoon. Slant. She tried to focus on mending a tear in her dress, but her hands shook too badly to thread the needle. She'd known him less than 2 weeks. It shouldn't matter this much, but the cabin felt hollow without his presence, without the sound of his breathing or the weight of his attention when he watched her work. When he finally appeared the tree in just before dusk, relief hit her so hard she had to grip the door frame to stay steady. He walked toward her slowly, and she saw why he'd been gone so long. In his hands was a rabbit, freshly caught and cleaned. Not just survival provision. He'd gone hunting despite wounds that weren't fully healed, despite the risk of reopening injuries that could turn fatal with infection. Nishoba stopped a few paces away and held out the rabbit, met her eyes with an expression that was part question, part offering, part something else she didn't have words for. This wasn't about owing her a debt anymore. This was about contributing, about partnership, however temporary, about saying through action what neither could speak. I see what you've given me. Let me give something back. Lenora stepped forward and took the rabbit from his hands. Their fingers brushed in the exchange. Neither pulled away quickly. The touch lingered, skin against skin, carrying electricity that had nothing to do with cold evening air. She smiled a real smile, the first and longer than she could remember. He didn't return it. His face remained serious, intense, but something in his eyes softened, something that recognized her gratitude and matched it with his own unspoken acknowledgement. That night, they prepared the meat together. She showed him how she cooked over the fire in her small hearth. He showed her a way to season it with herbs that made the simple meal taste like something worth savoring. They ate slowly, not talking because they couldn't, but the silence was full of conversation anyway. When she finally laid down on the floor to sleep, exhausted but strangely content, she heard him shift on the bed above her, heard him settle into rest with breathing that had grown steadier each night, and she knew with certainty that was both comfort and threat. This couldn't last. Eventually, he'd be strong enough to leave. Eventually, the world outside would remember they both existed. Eventually, a choice would have to be made that neither of them was ready for. But not tonight. Tonight, they had this a shared meal, a moment of peace, and the fragile understanding that sometimes the most impossible connections are the ones worth fighting to keep. 3 weeks in, the fragile peace shattered. Lenora was drawing water from the creek when she heard horses, not the wild ones that sometimes graze near the tree-in. These carried riders, multiple riders, heading toward her property from the direction of the nearest settlement, 3 mi east through rough terrain. She rarely traveled anymore. She straightened, heart hammering, and looked back toward the cabin. Nishoba was inside, stronger now, but still marked by healing wounds that would raise questions she couldn't answer. Questions that would turn dangerous the moment anyone saw him. The riders appeared through the trees. 3 men. She recognized from the occasional supply runs she made when solitude threatened to break her completely. Samuel Garrett rode in front, his gray beard and permanent scowl familiar in the worst way. Behind him, 2 younger men whose names she'd never bothered learning, but whose opinions about native tribes she'd heard plenty during those brief, uncomfortable visits to town. She set down her bucket and walked to intercept them before they reached the cabin door, forced her expression into something neutral despite the fear clawing up her throat. Samuel reined his horse to a stop, squinting down at her with a particular suspicion reserved for women who chose isolation over community. The other 2 spread out slightly, flanking her property line like they were checking for threats. Mrs. Hart. Samuel's voice carried that edge of concern that wasn't concern at all. Just nosiness dressed up as neighborly duty. Haven't seen you in town for weeks. Started wondering if you'd run into trouble out here all alone. Lenora met his gaze without flinching. No trouble, just managing my property. That's so. He looked past her toward the cabin, taking in details she suddenly saw through his eyes. The extra firewood stacked near the door, more than one woman would need. The second set of tracks in the dirt leading from cabin to creek, the rabbit skins hanging to dry that she'd never been particularly skilled at catching herself. Her mind raced. She could feel Neshoba inside, probably pressed against the wall beside the window, listening to voices he couldn't understand, but recognizing danger in tone and number. If they insisted on coming inside, if they saw him, if Samuel's prejudice mixed with fear and righteousness. Seems like you've been busy, Samuel continued, his eyes narrowing. Lots of work for one woman. You sure you're managing alone? The question hung heavy with implication. The two younger men had stopped pretending to check the perimeter and were watching her now with the same calculating suspicion. She could see the moment they noticed fresh boot prints near the woodpile. Prints too large to be hers. I managed just fine. Lenora kept her voice steady, despite the way her pulse themed against her ribs. Was there something specific you needed? Or did you ride 3M just to check on a widow who hasn't asked for help? Samuel's jaw tightened at the rebuff. Community looks after its own. Mrs. Hart, especially with natives getting bold lately. Heard there was trouble south of here. Small group, probably scouting. You see anything unusual? You let us know. The warning was clear, the threat clearer. She forced herself to nod. I'll keep watch. You do that. But Samuel didn't turn his horse around. His attention had caught on something else. Smoke coming from her chimney more than usual for a warm afternoon. You cooking something special? Before she could answer, one of the younger men spoke up. Thought I heard movement inside when we rode up. Everything slowed. Lenora watched Samuel's hand drift toward the rifle, strapped to his saddle. Saw a calculation cross his weathered face. The kind of calculation that ended with doors kicked open and questions asked at gunpoint. She had seconds to decide. Let them search and find Noba. Lie and make them more suspicious. Or I'm cooking. Stew. Her voice came out calmer than she felt. Takes time. Now, if you don't mind, I like to get back to it before it burns. Samuel studied her for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then he glanced at his companions, some silent communication passing between them that she couldn't read. Finally, he pulled back on his reins. We'll leave you to it then, but Mrs. Hart. He leaned forward slightly in his saddle. You remember what I said. You see anything unusual, anything at all, you let us know. They rode off, taking their suspicion and threat with them. But Lenora stood frozen in her yard until the sound of hoof beats faded completely. Only then did she let herself breathe. When she finally turned back toward the cabin, Noah stood in the doorway. Their eyes met across the clearing. No words needed. They both understood what had almost happened. What would happen if those men came back? That night, Neshoba made his decision clear without speaking a word. Lenora awoke to find him standing by the window, fully dressed in what remained of his original clothing, leather worn soft from years of use, the band with its single feather tied firmly around his head. His posture spoke of readiness, of departure, of endings neither of them wanted, but both recognized as inevitable. She sat up slowly from her place on the floor, every muscle protesting after weeks of sleeping on hardwood. He turned at the sound, and the look that passed between them carried the weight of everything. They couldn't say. She'd save his life. He'd honored that by staying until strength returned. But those men today had made the truth impossible to ignore. His presence endangered her more with each passing hour. He moved to the bed, knelt down, and carefully lifted the thin mattress. Beneath it, he'd hidden something. A knife, bone handle worn, smooth, blade sharp and clean. He'd had it the whole time. She realized a weapon he could have used against her any moment during those first vulnerable days. Instead, he kept it hidden, choosing trust over violence. Nishoba held the knife out to her, handle first, a gift, a promise of protection, even in absence. She took it with hands that trembled slightly, feeling the weight of worked bone and metal that had clearly meant something to him. This wasn't just a tool. It was part of who he was, and he was leaving it behind, like leaving a piece of himself. She wanted to argue to say he could stay. They'd be more careful. They'd find a way. But the words died in her throat because they were lies, and they both knew it. Samuel, Garrett would come back. Others would follow, and eventually someone would see what couldn't be hidden. A white widow, harboring an Apache warrior in her home, sleeping on the floor while he occupied her bed. The scandal would be the least of their problems. And Shoba reached out and touched her face just once, just briefly, his palm rough against her cheek, fingers tracing the line of her jaw with a gentleness that contradicted every scar and callus. She closed her eyes against the sensation, memorizing this moment because it might be all she ever had of him. When she opened them, again, he was studying her like he was doing the same thing, memorizing, preserving, taking this connection with him into whatever came next. He spoke, then words in his language that rolled like thunder and prayer, sounds she didn't understand but felt in her chest. Anyway, maybe a blessing, maybe gratitude, maybe something neither language had proper words for, the recognition of one soul by another across impossible distance. She responded the only way she could, reached up and covered his hand with hers, holding him there for 3 more heartbeats before letting go. Nishoba stood, moved to the door, paused with his hand on the latch, looking back one final time. The early morning light cut across his face, illuminating scars old and new, marking him as warrior and survivor both. She tried to imprint every detail, the set of his shoulders, the intensity in his dark eyes, the way he held himself like someone who'd learned long ago that the world offered no promises of safety or peace. Then he opened the door and stepped in a gray dawn. Didn't look back again, just walked across her clearing toward the tree-in with the steady gait of someone healed enough to survive the journey. Ahead, she watched until the forest swallowed him completely, until even the sound of his footsteps faded into morning silence. The cabin felt cavernous without him. She stood in the doorway holding the knife he'd left behind, feeling its weight like an anchor. The bed still held the impression of his body. The floor beside it still held the shape of hers. Evidence of connection that would fade with time, erased by the simple mechanics of living. Lenora closed the door, set the knife carefully on the small table where she took her meals, looked around at the space that it held. 2 lives briefly intersecting, and tried to remember what solitude felt like before she'd learned what it meant. To not be alone. Outside, the sun climbed higher. Inside, she began the work of returning to herself, or whatever version of herself existed now. Changed by weeks of choosing compassion over fear. Changed by the weight of a warrior's trust. Changed by the understanding that some connections matter more than safety. She didn't know she'd see him again. Didn't know that in less than 2 weeks, her entire world would shift in ways she couldn't begin to imagine. All she knew was that she'd made a choice, and whatever came from it, she wouldn't regret giving her bed to a man who needed it more than she needed the approval of people like Samuel Garrett. 2 weeks of silence felt like 2 years. Lenora fell back into routines that had sustained her through widowhood, but they rang hollow now. She hauled water alone, split wood alone, ate meals that tasted like ash because there was no one across from her. No presence filling the space with meaning. Beyond mere survival, the knife Nishoba left sat on her table, untouched but looked at constantly, a reminder of connection that felt increasingly like a fever dream. Had it even been real? Had she truly harbored an Apache warrior in her home, sleeping on the floor while he occupied her bed? The evidence remained. Boot prints too large for her feet, worn paths between cabin and creek that 2 people had walked, the faint scent of someone else lingering in fabric and air. But memories felt less solid with each passing day. Samuel Garrett rode by, twice more, always with questions disguised as concern. Each visit left her more isolated. The looks he gave her cabin suggested he knew something had happened, but couldn't prove it. The threat in his departure promised he'd keep watching. She stopped going to town entirely. Couldn't bear the judgment or the questions or the reminder that she'd chosen compassion in a place that traded in fear. Her supplies dwindled. She'd need to make the journey eventually, face the whispers and suspicion, but not yet. Not while everything still felt too raw. On the 16th morning after Neshoba left, Lenora woke to sounds that didn't belong. Low voices speaking in a language that wasn't English, the shuffle of many feet, horses snorting and stamping. Movement everywhere surrounding her cabin like a tide she couldn't see but felt pressing against every wall. She sat up fast, heart slamming against her ribs. Dawn light filtered through her window gray and, uncertain, the sounds continued, grew, multiplied. She grabbed the knife from the table with shaking hands and moved to the door, pressing her ear against rough wood. More voices. Children, laughing. Women talking. The crackle of fires being built. Smoke smell drifting through cracks in the cabin walls. Fear and confusion weared her chest. She was surrounded. But by what? Raiders. Settlers. Something worse. Lenora gripped the knife tighter and opened the door. The sight that met her eyes stopped her breath completely. Her field, the open space she'd maintained through 2 years of solitary labor, was filled with teepees, dozens of them. Canvas structures rising like a forest of geometric shapes, smoke curling from their peaks into morning sky. Horses grazed near the tree-in. People moved between the dwellings with the ease of established camp. Women tended fires. Children played. Warriors stood at intervals, watchful but not hostile. An entire Apache encampment had appeared on her property overnight, silent as spirits, but real as the ground beneath her feet. Lenora's mind struggled to process what she was seeing. This wasn't a raid. Raiders didn't bring their families, didn't set up cooking fires, and organize camps with the permanence of people planning to stay. This was something else entirely, something she had no framework to understand. Movement near the largest teepee caught her attention. A figure emerged, tall and commanding, wearing the bearing of someone used to authority. Behind him walked a second man, and Lenora's heart stopped for entirely different reasons. Neshoba. He looked different than when he'd left. Stronger, healed completely. His scars still marked him, but they no longer spoke of recent violence. Only old battles survived. He wore traditional clothing now. Leather decorated with patterns she didn't recognize but understood spoke of rank or honor. The single feather in his hair had been joined by others. Their eyes met across the impossible distance of her transformed property. She saw recognition in his face. Relief. Something deeper that made her knees weak. The older man beside him noticed the exchange. Said something in there. Language that made Neshoba nod. Then they began walking toward her. Not aggressive, not threatening, but purposeful. Coming to explain something that had no explanation she could imagine. Lenora stood frozen in her doorway, knife still gripped uselessly in her hand, while the man she'd saved and the people she'd feared approached, with an intention she couldn't begin to guess. The morning sun climbed higher, illuminating a scene that would have seemed impossible just months ago. Behind them, the camp continued its morning routine as if settling on a white woman's property was the most natural thing in the world, as if they belonged there, as if something had shifted in the fabric of what was possible. And she was standing at the center of a change she'd set in motion without understanding what she'd started. The older man stopped 3 paces from her door and spoke words in Apache that rolled with the weight of ceremony and significance. Neshoba stood beside him, and when the elder finished, he translated through gestures and the few English words he'd learned during his weeks in her care. He pointed to himself, made the sign for wounded, for dying, pointed to her cabin, to her, made a gesture that encompassed giving, healing, sacrifice. And he pointed to the scars on his chest, now fully healed, and to his heart. The meaning was clear. You saved my life when you could have let me die. The elder spoke. Again, Shoba's hands moved, painting the story in motions she could follow. His people had searched for him after the attack that left him bleeding in creek mud. Found and gone. Believed him. Lost when he returned weeks later, healed and strong with a story of a white woman who'd given her only bed to. An enemy who'd slept on bare floor while caring for wounds that should have taken him. The tribe had not believed it possible until Neshoba showed them the knife he'd kept, the one she'd used to cut bandages. Until he led them to the creek where she'd found him. Until he made them understand that everything their experience told them about settlers was wrong in this one particular case. The elder gestured to the camp filling her field. Noba, translated through signs. This is gratitude. This is protection. This is the Apache way of honoring a debt that cannot be repaid with simple words. Lenora's throat tightened. She tried to speak, couldn't. Her hand lowered, the knife hanging forgotten at her side. Neshoba continued. His gestures grew more personal now, less formal translation, and more direct communication between two people who'd learned to speak without language. He pointed to the camp, made it clear they would stay as long as she allowed. No settler would dare threaten a woman under Apache protection. Samuel Garrett and his suspicions meant nothing now. She was safer than she'd been in years. But then, Noba's movements changed, became a question instead of a statement. He pointed to himself, to her cabin, to her. The gesture was unmistakable. May I stay? Not as a warrior fulfilling debt, not as someone recovering from wounds, but as someone choosing to remain. The choice was entirely hers. The tribe would respect whatever she decided. If she wanted her solitude back, they'd leave with understanding. If she wanted only the protection of the camp, but not him specifically, he'd honor that too. But the hope in his eyes, the vulnerability and how he held himself while waiting for her answer, that told her everything his limited English couldn't. Lenora looked past him at the transformed landscape of her property. Teepees where there'd been empty grass, families where there'd been loneliness, life and noise and connection where she'd existed in. Silence, so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to be part of something larger than grief. She looked back at Neshoba, at the man who'd left her a knife and his trust, who'd honored her sacrifice by surviving, who'd brought his entire people to say thank you in the only way that made sense to a culture that understood actions, spoke louder than any words. Lenora set the knife on the ground between them, stepped forward, placed her hand over his heart, feeling it beat steady and strong beneath her palm. Then she took his hand and placed it over hers. The gesture needed no translation. Yes. Stay. Build something new here. Learn each other's languages and worlds. See what grows from impossible beginnings. Relief transformed his features. The elder, beside him, smiled. The first smile she'd seen from anyone in the camp, and said something that sounded like blessing or approval or both. That afternoon, Neshoba taught her the Apache word for home. She taught him the English word for tomorrow. They stood side by side while the camp settled into permanence around them. Two people from different worlds learning to exist in the space between, building something that had no name in either language, but felt right, in ways that didn't need explanation. The knife remained on the ground where she'd set it. Later, she'd pick it up and return it to him. Later, they'd establish routines and boundaries and figure out what this new life looked like. But for now, they simply stood together, watching the sun climb higher, over a field that had transformed from isolation into community overnight. Lenora Hart had given her only bed to a scarred Apache warrior weeks ago. Now his people filled her field not as invaders, but as family. And she understood finally that some acts of compassion echo far beyond the moment they're given, rippling outward until they change the shape of everything they touch. If you enjoyed this story of courage and unexpected connection, click The video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier, where honor and heart collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these.